Hello, and welcome once again to our looking at the upcoming scriptures this week for the 30th Sunday of the year. And the first reading comes from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 7 through 9. Again, from the work to the Hebrews, this time chapter 5, verse 1 through 6. And the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 46 through 52. We have been looking over the last few weeks to the 10th chapter of Mark, and this is the one that concludes it. And as you remember, the journey of Jesus has brought him from the north. Remember earlier on at the place called Caesarea Philippi, along the way Jesus has given three predictions of what is going to happen when he comes to Jerusalem. And the gospel now brings us to the city of Jericho. So the journey has really come from the north, now down as far south as he will be going. Jericho is located, as you probably know, 15 miles northeast of the city of Jerusalem. And in order to get to the city of Jerusalem is a long road that goes up. Think about it, 15 miles, but it's a circuitous route, but I think about 23 miles, because going up to a place like Jerusalem, after all, city of Jericho is below sea level. City of Jerusalem is above sea level by a number of feet, however they measure it. And so to climb up, you cannot just go straight. You have to kind of meander, I guess. And this road, used in a couple of the Gospels, particularly Luke in his famous story of the Good Samaritan, describes a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. In this case, Jesus will be going up to Jerusalem. So it's 5 miles west of the Jordan River, which of course is very significant in the history of Israel, and mainly because you will remember that it had been the Jordan River that Joshua, when he led the Israelites out of the years of wandering in the wilderness, had then moved up to the existing city of Jericho. And the famous story when Joshua and the Israelites blew the horns and trumpets, that the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Jericho is further located 6 miles from the Dead Sea, which is the outlet in which the River Jordan moves, and which there is no outlet, as you know, once it hits the waters of the Dead Sea. Jericho has a very interesting history. We may have mentioned this. It is perhaps recognized by many as one of the oldest extant places where cities were located. Archaeologists have had a kind of field day in Jericho. One of the more popular archaeologists of the 1940s and 50s was a British archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, who really put in many ways the situation of Jericho on the map. Subsequently, and it was her style, by the way, of archaeology that is today used by archaeologists throughout the world, rather than just digging up with a shovel, going and saying, let's see what we can find down here. She carefully made sure that every inch of soil that was taken out was carefully sifted and put in the right place so that nothing would be lost. Point being here is that it is estimated that there were at least 7 different cities located on the site of where Jericho is, dating all the way back to now estimates of at least 3,000 before the Common Time, and maybe even earlier, thus making it, as I said, one of the earliest, not cities, but certainly sites where cities were. So Jericho, therefore, is in an interesting place. It was, for those who would be traveling, a kind of oasis in the middle of rough terrain. See, so I said going up to Jerusalem, kind of mountainous area, Dead Sea, kind of dry, hot. So Jericho had sufficient water, which is always very important in the ancient world, and had a wonderful and a rich history, and in some ways was also a trading place. So it was not a port place. Now, and it had regained a certain popularity in Jesus' time because King Herod the Great, whom you remember ruled over Israel until his death in the year 4 before the common time, had decided to build a winter palace, not in Jericho, but right near it. And so that again kind of brought people there and interest to know where the royalty had a place and what it was like. So all of that's a little background for the fact that as Mark tells the story, Jesus passes through the city of Jericho. He's on his way. As I mentioned, the journey now to Jerusalem is about to, or the journey leading to Jerusalem is about to come to an end. And there, sitting on the side of the road, is a blind beggar. Now, who is named Bartimaeus. Interestingly, in Mark's story, not a lot of personal names are given. He is called Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Now, we know very little about him, either before or after, but Mark seems to find that important. The only other person named really in Mark's gospel is Jairus. Remember that it was Jairus' daughter who was sick and Jesus had healed him. Now, as Jesus is passing by, Bartimaeus, remember, is a blind beggar, hears that it is Jesus, and it is Jesus of Nazareth. Pointed out a number of times that that's important to identify where he comes from. That makes him unique, and apparently Bartimaeus has heard stories about Jesus, and he calls out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now the title is interesting because when he calls him Son of David, thus connecting him, if you think about it, going back to some discussions we had earlier, that David, of course, was considered as being one of the great messiahs of God, one of the great liberators that God had chosen for the people. If he is the son of David, is giving him a title that many who were looking for a Messiah in Jesus' time would associate with who the Messiah would be. So he calls out, "Have mercy on me, have pity on me." And you can imagine he's sitting in place. Now exactly where on the road, he must have been smart enough to know that if you're kind of going to sit on a road where people tend to pass by, your chances of getting some help, a beggar, after all, would be much better. But the crowd who are following with Jesus, now we're not sure how exactly to identify the whole crowd. Certainly the disciples are part of it. You remember our faithful disciples who are still kind of put together what it is that Jesus is going to do when he comes up to Jerusalem, and a number of other people. Now perhaps they were some who had joined Jesus on his journey, others who may have been gathered from Jericho itself. Remember, Jesus had passed through the city. Try to shush the beggar. Don't bother him. Be quiet. Don't. He reacts to this howling. How? By calling out even the louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me, have pity on me." And must have been loud enough that Jesus heard him, because Jesus stops and it says to the crowd, "Bring the man to me." Now, interestingly, and commentators are quick to notice this, and maybe we should, that the crowd, who 1 minute were saying, keep away, are now saying, "Oh no, don't be afraid. Come see Jesus." So, in a way, Jesus has turned the crowd into his helpers by wanting to enable the blind beggar, and keep in mind that he's blind, although he probably had the ability to know how to walk, to come into the presence of Jesus. So we see that Bartimaeus, to begin with, is rather a shrewd guy. He knows how to get the attention of Jesus by giving him a title that has not been heard before in the gospel and that will become a very important part in understanding the nature of who Jesus is. Now, when he gets in front of Jesus, or in the presence of Jesus, we're not sure just how that would have kind of placed out. Maybe he was standing in front of Jesus. Jesus asks him, "What is it that I can do for you? What is it that you want?" Now, this same little question was raised earlier on when we heard James and John come to Jesus, "What is it that you want?" Do you remember that Jesus said, they had said, "Oh, we want to be on the right and left hand when you come into your kingdom"? Well, in this case, Bartimaeus, in a certain way, as he stands in front of Jesus, might have thought, "Isn't it pretty obvious what I would like? That I may see." Now, it's interesting, the text that we will hear this Sunday or this weekend says that he was born that I might see, but many of the texts, and I'm not sure why we leave it out of ours, says that I may see again, which would indicate that at some point he was not always blind and therefore had some, visions of life and of what went on. So that's a kind of interesting little observation. As I say, what we're looking here in our talks is what the text says. And as we've noticed, sometimes Sunday or weekend readings, for whatever reasons, eliminate or, in this case, eliminate something. Blindness, by the way, was a very common in the ancient Middle East, okay? And it was probably due to glaucoma, which, as you know, is a contagious infection of the inner lining of the eyelids and of the cornea. And it was transmitted often by flies, and so that's how you could get it, or by poor hygiene. Although Israel was very important to remember about washing one's hands, particularly ritually, the reality was that because there often was a lack of water for washing and that this poor hygiene also served as a way in which blindness might occur. So just as a little bit understanding of what was really going on in the first century world of Jesus' time. Well, however it is that he received the blindness, he does receive the healing of Jesus, and he can see. Now, those of you who are kind of remembering how the story of Mark unfolds, is the second time that Jesus has healed a person who suffers from blindness. And characteristic of the Markan story that we have mentioned a number of times is his use of what we would call bookendings, that he starts an account or a story, and then he concludes it either with the conclusion of that story or with a similar story. So much like you might put obviously bookends to whole books, what had happened, when we think about it, is that earlier along the way, in chapter 8, verses 32 and onward, Jesus had cured the blind man, here he was nameless, and that he had gone through the appropriate rituals for healing, namely spittle and placing it on the eyelids of the man. And then remember that, and an interesting fact here is that Jesus said, "Can you see?" Well, he says, "Yeah, well, I see, but people look like walking sticks or trees." And so Jesus has to kind of do it again, and then the second time he can see clearly. Now, this is, of course, a Markan trick, because who is it that can never seem unable to see things clearly if not the disciples? Now, what is the bookend here? That the cure of this blind man and the cure of Bartimaeus include the whole journey of Jesus from the north now down to Jericho, to the entrance city, to Jerusalem. And what is incorporated between these two healings is the whole situation of the three predictions of Jesus' coming death in Jerusalem, and the inability of the disciples to get it. You remember that each time that Jesus had given one of these predictions, they had been caught up in other interests, okay? Who's most important and all of that kind of thing. Can I have this position, as we saw earlier? So Bartimaeus emerges as really a very loyal, he has great faith. See, and here, of course, has been the story all along. He has great faith in the ability of Jesus to heal. And that faith, of course, he articulates by the fact that when he gets up to come to Jesus, when Jesus had heard his cry and said, "Let him come to me," the man had thrown aside his cloak and come to Jesus. Now keep in mind, as we've noticed before, that there are two layers of clothing that persons wear, but that the cloak for the poor, and in this case, the beggar, was really his kind of portable home. That the cloak in the daytime probably was what he wore and laid out in front of him as he was begging. But also the cloak turned out to be the man's blanket at night, what he slept in. One of the reasons why in the scripture it was said that if you demanded from a person his cloak, you had to return it to him at night, even though he owed you money, because you put the person in such a severe situation. But the fact that he gets up and throws his cloak away indicates that he knows that Jesus is going to help him, and he will no longer need this, that something new and different is going to happen. So there are certain contrasts between the curing of the blind man at the beginning of these stories and the curing of Bartimaeus. As we mentioned, the first cure had been rather gradual and incomplete at the beginning. In this case, the healing of Bartimaeus is immediate and complete. The man in the first healing is sent home. And interesting, you remember, is told, don't tell anybody about what has happened. Don't go into the village. Of course, he had not done that, but that is what Jesus had told him. Here, when Bartimaeus is cured, he immediately follows Jesus. So he joins with the group now that is going to go up to Jerusalem. So the journey episode, as we have seen, is intended to help us see who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. So in this whole section, when we put together over the last few weeks that we have been listening to a section from Mark's story, the question to the disciples earlier on, who do people say that I am? So you see, it's a kind of learning who Jesus is by what he does, by what he encourages those who are with him to follow him, and what the costs, truly, the cost of discipleship is going to be. The way of Jesus, as it turns out, is to be the way of the cross. The way of rejection by his Jewish contemporaries. The way of betrayal later on by his own disciples. The way of suffering and death at the hands of Jewish and Roman authorities. But along the way, and these now you can go back from chapter 8, verses 22 to chapter 10, 52, which is the end of this chapter, he has taught his disciples who he is, what awaits him, and what it means to follow him. Bartimaeus has received the gift of sight, and he sets out on the way of Jesus, the way that leads to Jerusalem. So that brings to an end the story of Mark's journey of Jesus. I do mention that the first reading comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who does describe that there will be, and again Jeremiah in this chapter that is assigned to him, Jeremiah had been one of the prophets who had gone with the Israelites into exile, predicts that there will be a new exodus, that they will be released from the exile, and that there will be a remnant who had, now there's a little bit of background here, that the Assyrian army had taken over Israel. Now in Jeremiah's time, the Holy Land had been divided into two groups, the north, Israel, the south, Judea. In the year 721 before the Common Era, the Assyrians devastated the city of the northern kingdom, and then for various reasons allowed some to return. This is the development of an image known as the remnant. But Jeremiah goes on to say they didn't learn their lesson, and they will suffer the unfortunate pains of exile. But Jeremiah says that the Lord will constitute a new Israel who will be faithful to God. And the people who will do this are the people with no power. And of course, included among them, the lame, the blind, hence, I think, some allusion this time to Jeremiah's section, to the story and the cure of Bartimaeus. Now, so this is the end of the second section of Mark's story. The third section incorporates chapters 11 through 16. 11 and 12 will be Jesus' teaching and deeds and the words in Jerusalem. Chapter 13 will be what's called the apocalyptic discourse, and chapters 14 through 16 are the passion, death, and resurrection. Now we've seen that already because we read these things or looked at these things during Holy Week earlier in the year. And chapter 11 begins with the entrance of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. We will not be hearing that either because already we hear it. But when we come back next time to Mark's story, it will be with Jesus teaching in the temple area prior to his arrest. So that, as I say, brings to an end the journey section of Jesus. A word or two now about the worked letter, the discourse to the Hebrews. I've mentioned this on a couple of occasions. I know we get little opportunities to reflect on this, the work of Hebrews really is built on an extensive knowledge of Jewish scriptures. And there are a number of things I'd like to say. Most importantly, of course, Jesus is pictured as the new high priest. But let me point out something that I think we've overcome, but need to be very careful here, that sometimes the letter to the Hebrews seems to indicate what we would call the issue of supersessionism, namely that the role of the religion of Israel came to an end with the birth of Christianity. That therefore Judaism is not to be seen as a distinct religion from Christianity, but rather as the prologue. So in other words, Judaism gets ready for Christianity. Once Christianity comes, then Christianity moves alone or proceeds alone. That somehow Israel is finished or completed. It's done its job. Yes, we can smile and say all of these people got ready for the coming of Jesus. But notice this is a uniquely Christian interpretation, and one that really in recent years we have been very cautious about pursuing. In fact, I think a long period of time, going back all the way to the time of Pope St. John the 23rd, who argued that this is not to be the Christian position. But nevertheless, some have used, and that's my kind of point here, the work to the Hebrews as saying, Jesus is the head of a new covenant. And therefore, if you have a new covenant, well, what does that mean? There's an old covenant. And even there you can see how we have used this. But that is really an incorrect understanding of this particular work. Now, in the little section that we will hear this time from chapter 5, from the work of Hebrews, speaks about the fact of Jesus as our mediator. And that's an important understanding. A mediator in the ancient world was very important figure when you had two warring groups, or bloodshed, unfortunately, clan conflict often was something that would take place. And in order to bring both sides to some kind of conclusion, a mediator was necessary, and the mediator could not be a member of either of the two groups who were kind of having the dispute, because obviously then the thought was the mediator will side with the group that it came from. So in this case, Jesus is pictured as our mediator because, first of all, he is the Son of God, and clearly it is a title which the letter to the Hebrews regularly applies to Jesus, as the Son of God. But he also is one like us in all things. And this is again one of the points that the work of Hebrews present. In all things, even to the point of suffering, except sin. And so in that regard, Jesus is therefore the true mediator between the human family and the divine, because in a very rich way, and you can kind of see how developing Christian theology will develop from the work of the Hebrews. Jesus shares certainly the position of being Son of God, but also the position of knowing what the human experience is, not simply by word, but also by experience. And in that sense, he is able to emphasize with human failings. He's also able to recognize and serve the needs of God. So there's a lot of other thinking that certainly goes on in the letter to the Hebrews, but I did want to kind of point that out, and especially that this letter should not be used to see that Christianity supersedes, therefore takes over, therefore no longer is there any purpose to Israel. Unfortunately, that thinking was very prevalent throughout the Middle Ages and caused much hardship between Christians and Jews because of it. As I say, in recent times, We have relooked at that, and we have been encouraged by Scripture scholars and our leaders to avoid that kind of thinking. Well, once again, I thank you for being with us and hope that you have a good week.